What happens when certainty begins to crack? Not all at once, not with a grand collapse, but quietly from our mom. Through a body preserved in ice, a fish pulled from dark water, a pattern in stone that should not exist. History rarely changes in a single moment. More often it shifts when one stubborn fact refuses to fit the story we have already told ourselves. For generations, we have arranged the past into something neat and teachable. We draw lines between ignorance and knowledge, between the ancient and the modern, between what people once could do and what we assume they could not. It is comforting to believe that human understanding rises in a steady climb, that each century sees farther than the one before. But the past is not always so obedient. Sometimes it waits in silence, buried under ash, sealed in rock, hidden beneath the sea, until someone stumbles across a fragment that changes the shape of the whole. This is a story about those fragments, about discoveries that arrived like small disturbances and became something larger. A challenge to memory, to expertise, to the tidy confidence of textbooks. Some of these findings forced scholars to revise old timelines. Others revealed that extinction may not mean absence forever, or that ancient people may have understood more than later generations imagined. None of them erase science or history. Instead, they make both more honest and far more human. Because knowledge is never as fixed as we want it to be. It is a living thing revised by new evidence, humbled by surprise, strengthened by doubt. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside these forgotten cases. Not that the world is unknowable, but that the truth often arrives from the edges, where certainty fades and curiosity begins. So we begin there, in the cold, in the dark, in the places where old assumptions go to be tested. What if extinction is not an ending, but a pause in human awareness? In December 1938, along the coast of South Africa, a museum curator named Marjorie Courtenay Latimer stood over an unusual fish laid out among an ordinary catch. Its body was covered in thick scales that shimmered like armor. Its fins were not delicate rays, but fleshy limbs, almost like the ghost of a hand. She did not yet know it, but she was looking at a creature the world believed had vanished with the dinosaurs. The fish was a Coelacanth, a species known only from fossils and presumed dead for roughly 66 million years. In museums and classrooms, it belonged to prehistory, to an age of giant reptiles and vanished seas. Yet here it was, heavy and blue-gray, lifted from modern water into modern light. The discovery did not undo paleontology. It did something more subtle and more profound. It reminded science that absence is not always proof, and that the map of life still contains blank spaces. What followed was not a collapse of knowledge, but a recalibration of it. Scientists moved carefully, comparing bones, tissue, and anatomy to fossil records that now seem strangely incomplete. The Coelacanth did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as evidence, stubborn, physical, undeniable. It suggested that some branches of life endure in hidden depths, beyond the reach of routine observation, surviving not because we expected them to, but because the world is larger than expectation. There is something deeply humbling in that image, a creature written into the past, still moving through the present in silence. It asks us to consider how much of reality depends on where we look, and how confidently we declare a chapter closed. Perhaps the world does not hide its truths out of malice. Perhaps it simply waits, patient and unchanged, until we are ready to notice what has been there all along. And if one forgotten life could return from the margins of time, what else might still be waiting in the dark? Not impossible, only unseen. What if the ground remembers us more clearly than our theories do? In northern Tanzania, under a sky that had watched countless ages pass, a trail of footprints lay hidden in hardened volcanic ash. They were small, ordinary at first glance, the kind of marks a family might leave after rain. But these impressions had been waiting for 3.6 million years, and when scientists looked closely, they carried a message that unsettled the neat story of human beginnings. The prints showed balance, rhythm, and intention. Heel first, weight through the arch, push from the toe. It was the familiar choreography of upright walking, not clumsy, not experimental, but strikingly modern. Yet the beings who left these tracks belong to a time when many experts believed our ancestors were still moving between ground and branches, their bodies caught between old habits and a future not yet formed. That is what made the discovery so powerful. It did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as a pattern pressed into earth, as physical evidence that could not easily be talked away. The old timeline of human movement suddenly seemed less certain, less linear, less tidy. Evolution was still real, still deep, still unfolding over immense spans of time, but the path itself appeared more complex than the diagrams in a classroom had suggested. There is something intimate about a footprint. A bone can be studied like an object. A footprint feels like a moment. Someone walked here. Someone paused, shifted weight, moved forward. Across millions of years, the act is still recognizable. We know it because we do it too. And perhaps that is why these prints matter beyond science. They remind us that the past is not only made of skulls and tools, but of motion, presence, and ordinary acts. A step can survive longer than an empire. A brief passage across wet ash can outlast every explanation built around it. So the question lingers in the silence those walkers left behind. How much of human history has been misunderstood simply because we expected the journey to be straighter than it was? What if the oldest stories of surgery were written not in books, but in bone? In a museum drawer or an excavation trench, a skull can appear silent, reduced to shape and fracture. But sometimes, under the right light, it reveals an encounter between pain and care, between danger and human ingenuity. Across several ancient sites, archaeologists found skulls marked by carefully cut openings, clean, deliberate, unmistakably made by human hands. The practice is known as trepanation, and for a long time it seemed too sophisticated, too unsettling, to fit comfortably into simple narratives about ancient medicine. These were not random injuries. In many cases, the edges of the openings showed healing, which meant the patients had survived the procedure. Someone had cut into the head of another human being in an age without modern anesthesia, sterile operating rooms, or medical imaging, and that person had lived long enough for bone to begin repairing itself. Whatever the reason, trauma, pressure, ritual, desperation, or some blend of all three, the act required knowledge, steadiness, and an understanding of the body that later generations often underestimated. The discovery forced a difficult kind of respect. It is easy to imagine the past as medically helpless, as though compassion began only when science became modern. But these skulls suggest something more complex. Ancient people may not have understood the brain as we do. They may have explained illness through spirits, imbalance, or sacred forces. And yet, in the middle of those beliefs, they still observed, experimented, and tried to intervene in suffering with remarkable precision. There is something moving in that effort. A wounded person lying still. Another person kneeling beside them, choosing not to surrender to fate, but to act. Between fear and hope, a crude tool becomes an instrument of care. And maybe that is the deeper challenge these bones present. They ask whether wisdom should be measured only by what people believed, or also by what they were willing to attempt for one another when the outcome was uncertain and the stakes were painfully human. What if the deep past was not as dim as we imagine? In a cave in southern France, hidden beyond narrow passages and absolute darkness, ancient paintings emerged on stone walls with astonishing vitality. Horses seemed to turn mid-stride. Lions moved in groups. Shadows and contours were used with such sensitivity that the images felt less like primitive marks and more like acts of perception, carefully observed, beautifully composed, and emotionally aware. The Chauvet Cave paintings, dated to more than 30,000 years ago, unsettled a comfortable assumption about artistic progress. For years, many believed that early human art must have begun in rough and simple forms, gradually advancing towards sophistication. But here, near the beginning of known image-making, was work of extraordinary confidence. The artists used the curve of the rock to suggest muscle and motion. They layered figures to create depth. They understood something essential about how the eye reads life from line and shadow. This did not mean that history was wrong in some dramatic sense. It meant that history had been too eager to confuse age with simplicity. The people who made these images were not waiting at the threshold of imagination. They were already fully human in the most recognizable way. They wanted to preserve what moved them. The animals they painted were not diagrams. They were encounters, memories, presences carried from torchlight into permanence. And that raises a quiet but profound question about intelligence itself. We often treat knowledge as technical, measurable, cumulative, but art points to another kind of knowing, the ability to notice, to feel awe, to translate experience into form. That kind of intelligence does not always leave behind machines or monuments. Sometimes it leaves charcoal on stone, surviving in darkness long after the voices are gone. When we stand before those painted walls now, separated by tens of thousands of years, the distance contracts. We are still creatures trying to hold on to beauty before it disappears. We are still making meaning from light, memory, and the moving world. Perhaps the cave was never only a shelter. Perhaps it was already a kind of mind, opened in the dark. What if the oldest map of the sky was not written on parchment, but built in stone? On a plain in southern Turkey, long before cities, before metal tools, before the familiar architecture of civilization, massive carved pillars rose in circles from the earth. They belonged to Göbekli Tepe, a site so old that it seemed to rearrange the sequence many archaeologists had once taken for granted. Monumental building, it turned out, may not have followed settled farming. It may have come before it. That reversal mattered. For generations, the common story was simple. Humans learned to farm, farming created surplus, surplus allowed permanent settlements, and only then did large ritual or civic structures become possible. But Göbekli Tepe complicated that chain. Here were people who may still have lived as hunter-gatherers, yet they organized labor, shaped stone with astonishing precision, and created a ceremonial landscape filled with symbols, animals, and abstract meaning. The site did not erase the agricultural revolution. It asked a subtler question: what if belief, cooperation, and shared imagination were not consequences of civilization, but among its causes? Perhaps people first gathered not only to survive, but to belong. Perhaps the need to assemble around mystery, memory, or the sacred helped create the social bonds that later made villages and fields possible. There is something deeply moving in that possibility. It suggests that human progress was not built by hunger alone. It may also have been built by wonder, by the urge to mark a place as meaningful, by the desire to stand together under a widening sky and shape stone into a language no single person could make alone. And that changes the emotional texture of prehistory. The ancient world becomes less mechanical, less driven by necessity alone, and more recognizably human. These builders were not merely solving problems. They were asking questions with their hands. So the pillars remain, weathered and patient, holding open a question larger than archaeology itself. Did civilization begin with bread, or with the shared need to give mystery a home? What if a single body could overturn an entire idea of the past? High in the Alps, where wind scrapes across stone and ice, keeps its own silence, two hikers came upon what looked at first like a recent tragedy. A man lay frozen in the glacier, bent by time but not yet surrendered to it. Then the details began to emerge. The tools, the clothing, the astonishing preservation. He was not modern at all. He had been dead for more than 5,000 years. The world came to know him as Ötzi, the Iceman. What made his discovery so powerful was not simply his age, but his immediacy. Ancient history is often built from fragments, pottery, bones, ruins, scattered traces. But Ötzi arrived almost like a witness. His skin, his last meal, the wear on his body, even the injuries he carried into death, offered an intimate portrait of Copper Age life. Suddenly, a distant era no longer felt abstract. It had a face, a body, a human scale. And with that intimacy came revision. His equipment revealed technical skill, more advanced than many had assumed for the period. His carefully made clothing showed adaptation, planning, and environmental intelligence. The copper axe in particular forced scholars to reconsider what people of his time could make, trade, and carry across difficult landscapes. He was not a crude relic from a dim chapter of prehistory. He was a person shaped by knowledge, craft, in a world already rich with complexity. Yet what lingers most is not the technology, it is the strange tenderness of preservation. His final journey, interrupted by violence and sealed in ice, survived longer than the memory of his name. We do not know the language of his last thoughts. We do not know whom he loved, feared, or trusted. But we know he was real, and that reality narrows the distance between then and now. Perhaps that is why Ötzi unsettles us. He reminds us that history is not populated by types or stages of development, but by individuals who move through uncertainty just as we do. And if one frozen life can speak so clearly across millennia, how many other lives remain beyond our reach, waiting for time to loosen its grip? What if the ocean keeps archives of human ambition that no library ever could? Off the coast of a quiet Greek island, sponge divers descending through blue water came upon something that looked at first like debris from a broken ship. Bronze fragments, statues, timber, scattered cargo. But among the wreckage was a corroded object so strange that even experts struggled to name it. Inside that lump of green metal were gears, intricate, interlocking, astonishingly precise. It would later be known as the Antikythera mechanism, and its discovery altered more than one chapter of technological history. For years, the ancient world had often been described as brilliant in philosophy and art, yet limited in machinery by comparison with later ages. But this device suggested something far more nuanced. Built more than 2,000 years ago, it could model celestial cycles with a sophistication that seemed almost out of place in the timeline assigned to it. The mechanism did not belong to fantasy. It belonged to craftsmanship, mathematics, and patient observation. Whoever designed it understood motion in abstract terms and then translated that knowledge into metal teeth and ratios. It was not merely decorative. It was a working expression of thought. And in that sense, it felt startlingly modern, not because the ancients were secretly identical to us, but because their intelligence had already reached forms we had not expected to find so early. There is a particular sadness in discoveries like this, not only because they challenge assumptions, but because they hint at how much has been lost. If one device of such complexity survived by accident on the floor of the sea, how many others disappeared in fire, war, neglect, or simple decay? How much human ingenuity vanishes before it has a chance to enter the official record? And yet the mechanism offers something more generous than regret. It reminds us that history is not a staircase built in perfect sequence. It is a shoreline after a storm, with objects washing in from different eras of effort and imagination. Sometimes a civilization knows more than the future remembers. So the gears continue to turn in the mind long after the artifact itself falls silent, asking a question as old as memory. How many times has humanity discovered brilliance, only to lose the map back to it? What if a piece of stone could force us to relearn how civilizations speak? For centuries, the language of ancient Egypt stood before the world in elegant silence. Temples were covered in inscriptions. Tomb walls carried names, prayers, victories, laments. But hieroglyphs remained closed, admired as symbols, yet unread as language. The past was visible, but its voice was missing. Then, in 1789, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, soldiers uncovered a dark granodiorite slab near the town of Rosetta. At first, it may have seemed like one more artifact in a land already dense with ruins. But the stone bore the same decree written 3 times, in Greek, in Demotic, and in hieroglyphs. It was not a dramatic revelation in itself. It was a key, plain, physical, waiting for the right patience. The breakthrough took years, and it came through careful comparison rather than sudden genius. Scholars, most famously Jean-François Champollion, began to understand that hieroglyphs were not only symbolic images, as many had assumed. They could also function phonetically, carrying sound as well as meaning. That realization transformed an entire field. What had seemed ornamental became readable. What had looked like timeless mystery became human language again. And with language came a different kind of history. Egypt was no longer known only through Greek accounts, later legends, or the mute grandeur of monuments. Egyptians could begin, in a sense, to speak for themselves across the centuries. Their rulers, rituals, ambitions, fears, and daily concerns emerged with greater depth and contradiction. The civilization did not become less mysterious. It became less distant. There is something profoundly moving in that transition from silence to voice. Every undeciphered text is a reminder that human experience can endure materially and still remain inaccessible. A script may survive the fall of kingdoms, yet become as unreachable as birdsong from another age. To recover, it is not just to solve a puzzle, it is to restore relationship. So the Rosetta Stone remains more than an object in a museum. It stands for a quieter truth about knowledge itself. The world is full of meaning long before we know how to read it. And how many voices, even now, are waiting inside the silence we have not yet learned to hear? What if the deepest revolutions in knowledge begin with something almost too small to notice? In 1947, in a cave above the Dead Sea, a young shepherd searching for a lost goat threw a stone into an opening and heard the sharp crack of pottery. It was an ordinary gesture, careless and practical. Yet from that sound emerged one of the most important manuscript discoveries of the modern age. Inside the caves near Qumran were ancient scrolls, some preserved in jars, others in fragments. So brittle they seemed to belong more to dust than to language. They included biblical texts, community writings, prayers, rules, and commentaries. Documents that reached back more than 2,000 years. For scholars of religion, history, and language, the discovery was transformative. These were not medieval copies standing at a great distance from their origins. They were voices carried across centuries with astonishing closeness to the worlds that produced them. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not destroy faith, nor did they neatly confirm every tradition. What they did was more demanding. They complicated the record. They revealed variation in texts once imagined to have traveled unchanged. They showed that religious communities were living, interpretive, divided, disciplined, hopeful, and deeply human. Scripture, in this light, was not a frozen object falling intact through time. It was something transmitted by memory, devotion, labor, and disagreement. That realization can unsettle people, but it can also deepen understanding. A tradition becomes more meaningful, not less, when we see how many hands carried it, argued over it, protected it, and reshaped its language in response to the needs of a fragile world. Preservation is never passive. It is an act of care carried out under pressure from history itself. There is also something haunting about the image of those caves. Dry air, hidden jars, words sleeping in darkness while empires rise and disappear above them. It suggests that truth is not always lost when it leaves view. Sometimes it withdraws, waiting for a different century to ask better questions. And so the scrolls leave us with a final unease, gentle but enduring. When we inherit a text, are we receiving certainty or entering a long conversation that began before us and will continue long after we are gone? What if an entire branch of humanity could disappear so completely that we would mistake ourselves for having always been alone? In 1856, workers cutting limestone in Germany's Neander Valley uncovered bones unlike the ones they recognized. The skull was heavy-browed, the limbs robust, the form unsettlingly human, and somehow unfamiliar at the same time. At first, the remains were treated with suspicion, shaped by the biases of the age. Some thought they belonged to a diseased modern person. Others saw them as evidence of something older, stranger, and more consequential. Over time, more bones emerged from caves and sediments across Europe and Western Asia. A picture began to form. Neanderthals were not deformed outliers. They were a human lineage, close to us, but not us. For generations, they were cast in a role that said as much about modern arrogance as it did about ancient evidence. They were imagined as brutish, slow, half-finished. A convenient shadow against which Homo sapiens could appear uniquely refined, but the record kept resisting that caricature. Neanderthals made tools suited to their environments. They controlled fire. They cared for injured members of their groups. Evidence suggested symbolic behavior, pigments, ornaments, perhaps even forms of ritual attention to the dead. And then genetics added another quiet shock. They had not merely existed beside our ancestors. They had met them, lived near them, and in some cases had children with them. Their story did not end in clean separation. Part of it continues inside many living people. That discovery changed more than anthropology. It altered the emotional shape of human history. We were no longer the sole survivors of a simple upward climb. We were one surviving strand in a once richer human tapestry. Other kinds of humans looked out at the same cold dawns, hunted under the same skies, endured winters, losses, and small acts of tenderness we can only infer. There is humility in that realization. It asks us to let go of the flattering myth that intelligence, compassion, or resilience belonged only to those who happened to become us. Perhaps being human was never a single, inevitable definition. Perhaps it was once a conversation among many forms of kinship, now mostly gone. And if traces of another humanity still live in our blood, then the boundary between self and other may have always been thinner than we wanted to believe. What if disaster preserves what ordinary time would erase? In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum lived with the routines of trade, conversation, appetite, devotion, and fatigue. Then, in the year 79, ash, heat, and collapsing sky buried streets, homes, tools, bread, graffiti, bodies, whole moments of life arrested in place. For centuries, what remained lay sealed underground, not untouched, but held in a terrible kind of stillness. When excavations began to reveal these cities, the effect was unlike the discovery of a temple or a statue alone. This was not only grandeur, it was ordinary life made visible with unusual intimacy. A loaf in an oven, a joke scratched onto a wall, rooms arranged for comfort, work, and display. The Roman world, often remembered through emperors, battles, and marble ideals, suddenly appeared in domestic detail. History stepped down from monuments and entered kitchens, workshops, and courtyards. That shift mattered. It complicated the polished image of antiquity. Rome was not just empire at a distance, it was also laundry, arguments, commerce, worship, boredom, decoration, and noise. The buried cities expanded our understanding of what counts as evidence. Not only laws and literature, but objects of daily habit. Not only the voices of elites, but the imprint of common existence. In those preserved rooms, the past became less theatrical and more inhabited. There is something unsettling about learning through catastrophe. So much of what we know about these people survives because their world ended violently. Without the eruption, much of it might have faded through rebuilding, weather, theft, and slow neglect. Destruction in this case became an accidental archivist. It guarded what peaceful centuries might have worn away. That paradox carries its own reflection. Human life is fragile, but traces of it can outlast intention. We rarely know which gestures will remain, which rooms will speak for us, which small signs of living will become the evidence of an age. Pompeii and Herculaneum remind us that history is not only written by victors or thinkers, sometimes it is written by interruption. And in the silence of those buried streets, one question continues to echo. If our ordinary lives were suddenly frozen in place, what would the future understand about us, and what would it miss entirely? What if the oldest libraries of human thought are not built from paper, but from ice, sediment, and trapped air? In the 20th century, scientists began pulling long cylinders from deep polar ice and ocean floors, quiet, pale records that looked almost uneventful to the eye. Yet inside those layers was a chronology more patient than any king list or carved inscription. Year by year, particle by particle, the Earth had been keeping notes. Ice cores and sediment records transformed the way we understand the planet's past. Tiny bubbles preserved ancient atmospheres. Dust revealed drought and volcanic upheaval. Chemical signatures traced warming, cooling, abundance, collapse. These were not myths about climate or broad guesses based on scattered ruins. They were physical archives, allowing scientists to compare human history with environmental shifts unfolding across thousands of years. Civilizations once studied in isolation now appeared within larger systems of rainfall, harvest, migration, and stress. That change was subtle but profound. It challenged the old habit of telling history as though human societies moved independently of the natural world, guided only by leaders, inventions, and wars. Instead, the record suggested a more entangled truth. Empires flourished during favorable conditions and strained under prolonged instability. Settlements expanded where ecosystems permitted it and faltered when those foundations weakened. Human agency remained real, but it was no longer the only force in the frame. There is something strangely intimate in this kind of evidence. The atmosphere that touched ancient lungs can still be sampled from trapped air. Ash from a distant eruption can settle into ice and remain there for millennia, waiting for someone with the right tools to notice it. The planet, in this sense, does not forget easily. It stores consequences long after memory fades. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson these frozen archives offer. They remind us that history is not only a human conversation with itself, it is also a conversation with conditions, limits, seasons, and the silent systems that make life possible. We inherit not just stories, but climates, not just monuments, but thresholds. So as those ancient layers are lifted into the light, they leave us with a sobering thought. If the Earth remembers every change, every imbalance, every interruption, what kind of record are we leaving behind for those who will one day read us from the cold? In the end, these discoveries do not tell us that history is false. They tell us something more difficult and more beautiful. That history is alive. Again and again, the world has offered up a correction, not to humiliate us, but to remind us that understanding is never finished. A fish thought gone forever rises from deep water. Footprints in ancient ash reveal a stride more familiar than expected. A frozen traveler, a buried city, a machine from the sea, a text recovered from stone or cave. Each one asks us to loosen our grip on certainty and make room for a fuller truth. What connects these stories is not simply surprise. It is the way each discovery restores dimension to the past. Ancient people become less like symbols and more like neighbors across time. Observant, inventive, vulnerable, devoted, and often far more capable than later generations assumed. Even the natural world enters the story differently. Ice, ash, sediment, darkness, and depth are no longer just settings for history. They are its archivists, preserving traces of lives and turning silence into evidence. There is comfort in neat explanations. They allow us to believe that knowledge moves forward in a straight line, that the future always understands more than the past, that what is lost is gone, and what is known is settled. But the deeper lesson here is gentler and more human. Progress is real, yet memory is fragile. Wisdom can be discovered, forgotten, and rediscovered. Entire worlds of meaning can endure just beyond the edge of what we currently know how to see. Perhaps that is why these cases continue to resonate far beyond archaeology, science, or history. They mirror something intimate about being human. We are all, in one way or another, trying to piece together incomplete evidence about our origins, our beliefs, our place in time. We inherit stories, revise them, and pass them on, knowing they will someday be revised again. So maybe the final question is not whether the past can still surprise us. Of course it can. The deeper question is whether we are willing to meet those surprises with humility. Because truth is rarely a monument standing finished in the sun. More often, it is a faint outline in the ice, a voice inside a forgotten script, a shape emerging slowly from the dark, waiting for us to listen more carefully than before.